when we're seeing Palestinian organizations and movements reiterate the importance of struggle and of staying strong and staying true. And nobody's paying the price more than Palestinians who are doing that. So in that spirit, I think we're here to try and strengthen our capacity to resist and to support the resistance. And part of that is about adopting a research agenda that looks beyond the sort of obvious ways that we see Zionist institutions and Zionist politics driving violence, and trying to understand how they actually work, where they draw their power, rather than sort of objecting to them and leaving it at that. And Hil Aked has written this incredible book, which it's called Friends of Israel, the Backlash Against Palestine Solidarity. And it is about the backlash against Palestine solidarity, but it's actually about a taxonomy of Zionist power, how the Zionist movement builds power, how it has historically built power, and how it interrelates with the politics in the places where it's working, including, in this case, in Britain and in the United States, how the interests of Zionism are connected to the interests of imperial power, and how the Zionist movement uses our culture ways and our political and communal organization as a pathway to perform the work that it's trying to do. So even though we're in this horrifying moment, I feel like we're privileged to be in conversation with Hil to hear about this research and learn from it as a platform from which to resist. So thank you so much, Hil, for being here. I wanted to ask you as an opening question, we've all seen how unbelievably the news and even public conversation about the genocide in Gaza seems to be able to completely dehumanize Palestinians, to look at a crying mother, a crying Israeli mother who's missing her child, and have enormous empathy that reporters are crying, and there's posters all over the city saying kidnapped, and yet we know that Palestinian children are kidnapped as well, not by a sort of ragtag army, but by one of the most powerful armies in the world and the most technologically advanced armies in the world, and it simply doesn't seem to move anybody. And we also know that that's tied very closely to anti-Semitism discourse, which is so powerful and draws so much on the anti-racist commitments that the United States articulates. Not that it honors them, but that are central. So I wanted to ask you if you could just begin by addressing that. You have this amazing tool that tells us how Zionism operates as a political and cultural force, and I just wonder if you could help us interpret the news.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I think even I, having written this book and studied this book and been aware, as I know you are and many of the people here today will be attuned to the Zionist movement, the Israeli government, the way that Palestinians are spoken about and dehumanized. Even I've been shocked by just the level of dehumanization and genocidal language that we're seeing come out of the woodwork. So I think many people will have seen this, but I wanted to read the tweets that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, sent out recently, because I think they just sum up kind of a lot of what we need to know. So I think maybe these were deleted afterwards, but I think it was just before the massacre at the Al-Ali hospital. Netanyahu tweeted, "Hamas is part of the axis of evil of Iran, Hezbollah, and their minions. They seek to destroy Israel and murder us all. They want to return the Middle East to the abyss of the barbaric fanaticism of the Middle Ages, where we want to take the Middle East to the height of progress. This is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle." And a Palestinian friend, shared that, and she just said, it's fully a mask-off racism moment, because this is I thought it was for a minute I was is this a parody? But it's not, it's for real, right? This is pure Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations narrative that has structured the war on terror for a long time, and Israel-Palestine is at the heart of the war on terror narrative. And I think that I was reflecting on this today, like what drove, like what, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, you know, I'm just a random British person, but what was it that, for me, that attracted me so much to the cause of Palestine, and why was it such a radicalizing political issue for me that helped me understand the entire world and all the other political issues? Not only is it the dignity of the Palestinian people in their resistance and their quest for justice and quest for return, it was also the way that the racial discourse and the impacts of that racial discourse, namely the genocide that we're seeing play out in Gaza today, I think they shake the foundations of what we like to call Western civilization, you know? And I've been like barely able to look at the British media, the BBC, the Guardian, the way they report it. It's disgusting. You know, I get my news from like following Mohammed Al-Kurd on Instagram, because you see what's actually happening. And you know, I have a chapter at the end of the book on the media, systemic media bias, and, you know, the Zionist movement plays a role in that. It's almost a bit of a hackneyed, cliched thing to talk about media bias, but we're seeing it so deeply now. And yeah, I think the connection to the book is that the Zionist movement has played a role in, over time. It's not like, you know, the Zionist movement called up Rishi Sunak and told him, like, this is what we want you to do, go and shake Netanyahu's hand. It's nothing like, it's like, it is a product of British imperialism, like, it was fostered by the British Empire. And it's embedded in Zionism as an ideology and as a movement. It is embedded in British and American culture, and it has played a role over decades in racializing Palestinians as terrorist, barbarian, anti-Semites, and that is legitimizing the genocide that we see, and it explains the dehumanization that we see today.
I want to ask actually a little bit more about the mechanisms of that, because your book, what's so helpful about your book is that it clarifies the idea of taxonomizing Zionism, which is really how I'm thinking about what you've done, is a clarification of the kind of murky morass of Zionist institutions that, at least in the US context, that we see everywhere. So Zionist institutions are in politics. They sometimes enter as grassroots organizations. They, they enter as like legal advocates and legislative advocates, or allies in anti-racist movements. They're educators in schools. So they're kind of everywhere. And it's difficult to get a handle on them. Hil has given me permission to talk about the Anti-Defamation League, even though I probably should stop talking about it for a little bit. But the Anti-Defamation League, for instance, when it enters a school as an educator, often on Holocaust education, or sometimes in response to a racist incident, and nobody perceives it as a Zionist organization necessarily whose work is in politics. So we have this sort of these organizations that wear many hats, and it makes them difficult to interpret. So as you mentioned, Zionist organizations are seeding this Islamophobic discourse. They are seeding this sort of sympathy for colonizers and for a colonization project, and yet they're doing it by occupying the space of anti-racism. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that tactic, about the tactic of being in many places at once and occupying both a right-wing political space and an anti-racist space. And what is that? How do they do it? And how should we understand it? And what does it mean for the rest of our work?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking is the fact that, in my opinion, the very first target of the Zionist movement has always been the Jewish community, Jewish communities, plural. I'm not going to lecture this audience. I think most people know that, like, Zionism is absolutely, its support for it within Jewish communities and as well has been contingent on historical factors, and there's always been Jewish resistance to it, and we're seeing a lot more now. Like, I was very heartened, and I know Palestinians were really heartened to see Jewish Voice of Peace get arrested by occupying Congress to try and, call for a ceasefire and stop the genocide. But yeah, it's been said so many times, but the conflation of Zionism with Judaism is going on here. I think when it comes to the way that the Zionist movement tries to really kind of play whack-a-mole in every different sphere of society is important, because it's not, I think sometimes the term lobby, when we talk about the Israel lobby, I think that's one of the many reasons I prefer Zionist movement, is that it's not just about like high-level lobbying of like Congress or Westminster in Britain. Like, it's a movement that, seeks to defend Israeli apartheid at every level. So in Britain, I was thinking about this today, like almost a kind of the way that they've bombed this school in Gaza, this hospital in Gaza. In Britain, what happened maybe a month or two ago was that a Zionist group called the UK Lawyers for Israel got some artwork made by children in Gaza taken down from the walls of a hospital in London, and there's something about, I haven't quite worked this out yet, but there's something about, like, I almost want to call it like Zionist fragility, like the ideological, the need to, there's this real sense of precarity, this real sense of like, we are always under threat and we must stamp out, it's also the genocidal colonial logic that's inherent in Zionist ideology of like stamping out Palestinian identity, along with Palestinian art. But what I argue in the book is that in certainly, countries like Britain and wider Europe and the US, we're seeing a real intensified conflict in civil society, which is a correlation of the rise of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. So we were talking earlier about how I think it's really important when I talk about the Zionist movement, I tried to not invisibilize Palestinian resistance and solidarity, the solidarity movement. So it's about, I argue that the Zionist movement strategies have very much responded to resistance, Palestinian resistance and Palestinian liberation and solidarity. And, there's quite a few examples of how they try to organize, for example, like when Trades Union Friends of Palestine was founded in Britain, they very quickly founded Trade Union Friends of Israel. So they're not already in these spaces, but they try to respond, and they even try to mimic the tactics of, the left and grassroots organizing at points. But yeah, it's increased in recent years exponentially as the BDS movement has gained ground. The BDS movement's founding principle was that governments have failed to deliver justice for Palestinians, right? And so we must look to civil society, to people of conscience around the world, in the same way that Black South Africans did under apartheid, to isolate Israel. And so they moved through civil society, whether it's universities, faith arenas, trade unions, student unions, and so that's where we're seeing, that's where the Zionist movement needs to respond. So you get like all kinds of controversies happening in, like a tiny theater, like a film festival. The example I gave of the hospital, like the letters page of like a wine magazine. It's like every area of life becomes a conflict because it's so embedded in the fabric of kind of our societies, and because, it needs to be challenged in all those places as well. That made sense.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because one thing, certainly I imagine that's everyone's experience, that no matter where you go, where you open your mouth, that there's always somebody there to be like, but Jews, but why are you being anti-Semitic, and diverting attention from our conversation about the state and imperialism and violence and Palestinians. But what you are able to articulate in the book is why, right? It's not just that everywhere you go that imperialists are sprinkled around, right? That has actually been a condition that has been created. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit about how, so we have the sense in the US and probably in other places as well, it's similar, that when people speak about their own ideas or their community or their feelings, that they are speaking from a sort of grassroots place, right? And what you've identified in the book is that that's actually not, it's not organic. That it's the product of we all know about Hezbollah, right? That's not like we know that there's a sort of cultural, a movement to seed Zionism in culture and to sort of present Zionist culture as nice and liberatory and fun. But I think what you articulate in the book that's so useful is how it's different with Zionism, right? It doesn't just happen. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that is constructed?
Yeah, so I don't want to get too academic at like the current moment especially, but I use the concept in the book of like social movements from above and social movements from below. They don't necessarily, those two concepts correspond to like elite actors and grassroots actors, but it's about like structures of oppression, or like hegemonic and counter-hegemonic actors, if you want to use that language. And you know, I was asked a while back about like, was Zionism ever a social movement from below? Because it historically had like grassroots support, more grassroots support than it has now, right? So like many like Zionist families at some point had a blue box in their house for the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, as you know. And like, I think that is receding, and all the Israel's own polling shows that like support for Israel has been on the decline for years, including in Jewish communities, especially in the younger generations. And so, yeah, what we're seeing, as I said, is that they're trying to, in some instances, mimic tactics of the left. And I like chart in the book about how one of the tactics that's been used is kind of constructing civil society organizations to give the impression that there's widespread grassroots support for Israel, when in reality that's not the case. So in Britain, there was an Israeli diplomat called Shai Masot who was caught on camera by an Al Jazeera undercover documentary maker, plotting to sort of, quote unquote, take down MPs. But one of the more interesting bits for me was not that they sort of like want to influence Westminster, but that he was also encouraging and helping the creation of like Friends of Israel in the city, you know, the financial district in London, or like he was encouraging the undercover reporter, actually not knowing, thinking he was a pro-Israel activist, to set up a young Labour Friends of Israel because they're worried about losing the younger generation in the Labour Party, which is the like lefty liberal, not that left anymore, party in Britain. So, and that's something I trace that I show is not new into the Zionist movement. We talked earlier about how like the Zionist movement, like Israel is and it isn't exceptional. It's unusual, I think, to the extent to which non-governmental organizations brought the state into being, like the World Zionist Organization, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, Keren HaYesod, and then those organizations have continued to exist and form a sort of the backbone of a propaganda network. But there's all the time there's been new institution building and in different spheres of society to respond to like the Arab League boycott in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and more recently to respond to BDS. And yeah, I guess I wanted to touch on the part of your question that was about like IRA or IHRA, racism and stuff, and occupying the anti-racist space. In my book, I argue, and you know, many Palestinian and Jewish scholars have argued, there's been so much ink spilt on IRA that I didn't want to talk about it too much, but you know, you can't avoid it because it is a central kind of tool that's used. But in my book, I argue that it's not actually unique. Like, it's the way that the Zionist movement and the Israeli government gaslights Palestinians and says, you can't talk about the Nakba, you can't name your experiences of racial discrimination. If you do, you're actually the racist. But that's kind of like, it's not a million miles away from what they've seen in, you know, yeah, I come from London, and like in Britain, there's been a massive gaslighting of communities of color there by this official report that the government commissioned, which said, you know, racial, institutional racism, it doesn't exist. We're not a racist country anymore. And I think there's this global phenomenon, and I use the work of people like Aaron Kanani and Liz Fakiti from the Institute of Race Relations in my book. There's this global phenomenon of the thinning out of what we understand racism to be. And it's not anymore, or what the IRA argues is that it's like, you say something that hurts someone's feelings and, you know, they feel offended. Actually, the racism that kills, of course, is structural racism that, like, can't remember Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's exact phrase, but like that shortens your lifespan because you're living in poor housing, and in the context of Gaza right now, that justifies genocide by almost invisibilizing Israeli apartheid and creating this selective empathy and to people who are dying on our TV screens.
Yeah, you're talking about the removal from conversations about racism and even about liberation of questions of who has power in that condition, and we've seen that in many spaces where Zionist organizations intervene. One, I mean, the most obvious is that when we're being asked, actually, as not just on the news, but as organizations make statements in support of Palestinian liberation, in support of decolonization, there's always the like, well, why didn't you mention, what Hamas did to Israelis? This sort of the construction of an equivalency that demands only looking in the present, that erases colonization, but also pits, it sort of posits identities as the same, right? You're a Palestinian and that's your identity, and I'm Jewish and that's my identity, and therefore that's the only basis on which we can evaluate our experiences, and power and history are excised from them. And as you note in your writing, that's a process that it's been iterative. That that over the course of time, in every instance where Zionist institutions have been pushing back on colonial resistance. So in the case of the Arab boycott in the 70s, and in the case of BDS, and now in the case of the Gaza genocide, that the articulation of the issue is always, it borrows from liberal commitments to opposing racism, right? We're post-civil rights, we're post-Holocaust, we're post-civil rights movement. We don't agree with racism, but then it misdefines racism in a way that just says, like, we don't say bad things about a group, right? As opposed to looking at how power operates. And you have a term for this, or a term for the way that it's used. And the term that you use, which it's new to me, although maybe it's in political science, it's more, common, is new public diplomacy. And so just to give a little bit of background, so this is one of 4 analytics that are in your book. One is social movements from above, which describes how Zionist institutions create something that looks like a social movement, a sort of demand for a politics, but in fact it's constructed from above. The second one, I'm just going to run through them all. The second one is state-private networks. Actually, I'm going to let you define that one. New public diplomacy, which is a sort of soft power, where a sort of demand is created in civil society for a particular, for politics that support Zionist aims. And then the fourth one is manufactured civil society, which is this sort of network of like Friends of Labor, or Israel Friends of Labor, I don't know, Labor Friends of Israel. That's the title of the book. Okay. So if you could just talk to us a little bit about, maybe we'll run through more of these analytics, but if you could talk to us about new public diplomacy and how we should understand that, because I don't think that there are many of us who work on Palestine liberation and work on anti-Zionism know a lot about how Zionist organizations work. I don't think this is something that's in our toolbox.
Yeah, I can talk about that. I mean, I think I just wanted to touch on the very beginning of your question. You made a very good point, which was about like the liberal alibis of like most oppressive movements. So I would draw a comparison with South African apartheid and its propaganda, and like I believe, although it probably has less purchase than the weaponization of anti-Semitism does in the case of Israel, that they did deploy arguments like this is anti-white, right? I compare it, as a trans person to the organized transphobic movement, and how you're hurting women. Obviously, Israel also tries to pinkwash and use queer rights as a liberal alibi, and argues that Zionism is Jewish self-determination rather than an ethno-exclusivist ideology. But those liberal alibis, they kind of fool people, I suppose, sometimes. And it kind of relates a bit to what I'll explain new public diplomacy is. I don't think it is actually a complicated idea. It's like a fancy academic term I used my PhD to describe a simple idea that we know that states lie, that governments lie, and the first victim in war is truth, right? And we've seen that, right, with the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza. Israel absurdly, tries to claim that the Palestinians have bombed themselves, right? Incredibly, it has some credence on the BBC where they're like debating like, what do we know about who did it, rather than how do we stop these war crimes. But most publics aren't fooled, right? Most publics today are skeptical of state power and official representatives of state power, especially a state like Israel. But most states, we know that people believe politicians, rightly, are corrupt and liars and spineless. So what New Public Diplomacy says is, we're not going to really be successful with delivering our PR messages. They're not going to land if we do it ourselves. We need a third party to do it for us. So that's when Zionist civil society organizations come in. So we tend to look at like civil society organizations as like benign, democratic, grassroots, independent, benevolent, and as someone who works for an NGO in Britain, like obviously those do exist, and they're sort of like nice like charity worker types. But I think there isn't a lot of academic work, and maybe it's not that understood, and we don't talk enough about the fact that civil society can become an arena of state power, and some civil society actors, the entire function of their work is to defend state power, and that's what the Zionist movement does for Israeli state power and the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza now. And I don't think that is new either. So there's a quote from David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, in the book, who says that explicitly, like that's the unique power of the Zionist movement. I'm not quoting verbatim here, but the Israel can only do so much in official kind of terms. It's supposedly bound by certain rules, but Zionist movements have a kind of like degree of reach into civil society that the state doesn't always have. And when you combine the two, like the resources of the state, the power, the coordinating abilities of the state, with the reach of the Zionist movement and the sort of perception that they're independent, benign, that it's just like, I'm just a Jewish person speaking up, rather than this is a Zionist, like person from a Zionist organization, it's a political issue, then you have quite a potent combination. So that's like why I think it was important to try to spell that out, yeah.
So just to expand on that a little bit, in the book you talk about it as sort of an expansion on the Cold War patterns of soft power. So what we're familiar with in Cold War soft power is when a government, the U.S. government, often works through cultural or civic institutions to try and build support for something. And an example that comes to mind is that when the U.S. government was trying to oppose leftist revolutions, leftist governments in Central America, that one way that it did that was to use the right wing of the U.S. labor movement to go into Central America and set up unions. They were unions of workers, but not necessarily like low-level workers. For example, in Chile, famously, the AFL-CIO helped set up a union of truckers who owned their own trucks. So they were truckers, but they were also owners. And that union, my recollection of the history is that they were organized to do stoppages that contributed to Allende's incapacity to fight off the coup. So that's the kind of soft power where you're like using civil society organizations to sort of seed the idea that actually what workers need is capitalism, right? And then those institutions are in place when you're trying to do real material work in the country. Okay, so that's soft power. And what you're saying in this case is that it doesn't have to be operated by the state, right? It doesn't have to be so top down. So can you just give us a few examples of how that new public diplomacy, like material examples of organizations and what they've done, how they've worked?
Yeah, so until recently, Israel had a ministry, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which was mandated to fight the BDS movement. It's now, I think, in the last couple of years, been absorbed back into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it's still doing the same work. So monitoring what BDS activists, the Palestinians, and their allies are doing, particularly in the Western countries, which are so crucial for diplomatic and military support for Israel. And I don't think it's at all as simple as operating and telling pro-Israel groups what to do, but they certainly try to coordinate. There's a forum called the Global Coalition for Israel, which is a high-level meeting that takes place usually in Jerusalem, where the leaders of Israel, pro-Israel groups from around the world are asked to attend and, hear lectures from Israeli ministers to, of the key PR messages that they have, the resources to have tested and focus grouped and worked out what works, right? Another very important point to make is that there is a body called Concert, which was originally called Kelesh Shlomo or Solomon's Sling, that exists, and it's a sort of private-public partnership. And what it allows the Israeli government to do is to fund or offer funding to pro-Israel groups that it wants to support their work, whilst getting around the kind of problems associated with directly funding it. So here in the US, there's FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I don't use the terminology of foreign agent at all in the book because I think it's xenophobic, and I explain all that. But that's the law here, and if a non-governmental actor was to accept funding directly, they would have to register on the Foreign Agents Register. But if it's coming from a third party, through a little mediating vehicle, you're good. And we know, for example, I believe Christians United for Israel, which is a Christian Zionist organization founded by the evangelical TV preacher John Hagee. I never know how to say his name, Hagee. They'd taken at least $1 million. It's less clear, who has and who hasn't, gotten funding this way. But I was reading an article recently about a group that's been very influential in Britain called Campaign Against Antisemitism, how they were revealed to have received funding from the Jewish National Fund UK, which is one of the key parastatal organizations central to the Zionist movement, founded in, I think, 1901, that's been central to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and still is, actually. So, yeah, there's these complicated funding streams somehow, and I want to reiterate, not necessarily taking direction, but I trace the existence of not just the global forums, but some forums that exist in Britain that kind of loose committees to bring together Zionist actors from across the spectrum, because it is a spectrum, right? I mean, liberal Zionism was always a paradox in my view, and it is shrinkingly small. Clearly we're seeing the most rabid, racist, and right-wing version of Zionism dominate in Israel and around the world. But, those supposedly liberal Zionist actors are seen as a useful tool, and they still exist. But these loose committees sort of bring all the different groups together with the Israeli embassy to coordinate, essentially. And that doesn't mean there's not conflict, there's not a homogenous bloc. They sometimes, compete for funding, and there's tensions. But on issues like BDS, and obviously now, they work together to defend Israeli apartheid, yeah.
I have two more questions for you, and then maybe we'll take some more questions from the audience. This is the first question, and I'll come to the second separately. Let's talk a little bit about how we got to this point. Let's dig into the history. The one sort of piece of wisdom from the study of history is that history is very specific, right? We know that imperialism is a sort of form. You can trust power to do something disgusting to maintain power, right? But the specificities of what happens in history, they're very specific to each instance. And you do a really clear job of articulating how the formation of the Israeli state created, is very specific and singular, and created this circumstance where there's this sort of dense network of non-governmental organizations. Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, so to give a little potted history, the World Zionist Organization is founded in, I've forgotten, 1897, I want to say. It's a year or two around the time that Theodor Herzl, the kind of ideologue father of the Zionist movement, writes the Jewish state, der Judenstaat. And then the World Zionist Organization founds out of it at the World Zionist Congresses, these meetings that happen other organizations, the Jewish National Fund I've mentioned, which is primarily about like colonizing Palestine, Keren Hayesod, which is a fundraising body, and the Jewish Agency, which is about like facilitating Aliyah, which is a Zionist term for Jewish immigration to Israel. So they each had their kind of different functions, but they work together. And obviously with the kind of deep complicity of my government, which issues the Balfour Declaration, which is issued to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain, because all these big Zionist kind of organizations that found the infrastructure have affiliates around the world, in the US, in Britain, in South Africa, like all over. So yeah, and they you know, as I said, I mentioned earlier, but I want to emphasize, you know, there was not a lot of support. The Zionist Federation of Great Britain was founded because there was not a lot of support for Zionism in British Jewry at all. That changes over time with the rise of Jewish persecution of Jewish people in Europe and culminating in the Holocaust for quite understandable reasons. I mean, more people start to think, oh, we need a Jewish state, and they, you know, choose not to look at the fact that, like, there's already people living there, Palestinians living there. This wasn't terra nullius, okay? So, but yeah, I guess what is interesting is that those organizations didn't just cease to exist, being like, oh, great, we've got our state now. The kind of power relationship between what then became the State of Israel and those organizations changes, and now they're about, you know, encouraging support for Israel abroad rather than like lobbying for the creation of the state, but they still exist. But yeah, I think they're not unique as well. I do talk a bit in the book about the Cold War, which you mentioned earlier, and how foundations like the Rockefeller, Carnegie Foundation supported US power during the Cold War, and they kind of helped to, and there's a whole chapter on universities in the book, because I'm quite interested in, we hear a lot about censorship, and we hear a lot about the repression of scholarship and activism on campuses, which is very real, but there's not enough chat. I think it's also interesting that like Israel studies as a subject has developed and is very, very much tied to Zionist funding. But and I draw a parallel with the US foundations, which helped to kind of create international relations as a discipline, and they founded universities in countries overseas which are deemed to be kind of a bit anti-US, and they kind of set up institutions. I think maybe the American University in Beirut is one, which are kind of peddling, again, a soft power kind of a pro-American empire ideology in a very subtle ways.
The thing that's so interesting about this history is that it kind of answers the question, when people ask Palestine Solidarity or Palestine decolonization activists, like, why are you singling out Israel, right? Usually, and correctly, the answer is, you know, you choose from your menu, right? Like, one, it's doing things that need to be paid attention to, right? Two, it is doing the most of X thing. But also, the history that you're laying out is a singular history. So there is, like, what other country, what other state or military power has an organization, an NGO, that determines land policy inside the state, right? That determines Palestinians can't live on X land and this land is used for that. And then outside the country function as charities, and also sort of are able to develop affective connections, loyalties from individual people in the way that the JNF is. So we have the JNF was an advocate for the state. And then the state comes in and the JNF doesn't stop existing because its goal was met, right? Now it becomes an advocate for the state in a different way. So there is this sort of dense network that you're pointing to of advocacy organizations that function, and as you note, Ben-Gurion recognizes this, that they allowed the state to operate in the political society and the culture of other places that are actually unique to the Israeli state. And I think we often spend so much time defending our right to focus on human rights abuses and on imperialism, and not be told that we're being anti-Semitic, that we actually don't stop to think about how singular it is. So I think it's really useful that you articulate that for us through the history. The last question that I want to ask you before we open it up is about resistance. So, of course, our resistance to power has to be calibrated to how we understand that power works. So, for example, the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is often critiqued from the left, not trashed, right, but just critiqued, that it's not necessarily decolonial, right? We're withdrawing our financial support from the state. That's, you know, we're sort of demonstrating something, but fundamentally it's not anti-colonial. But if the way that Zionist power works is cultural, is like by sort of by outsourcing the kind of force that usually is exerted by a state, outsourcing that to NGOs, and then sort of positioning it as grassroots force, then creating a movement of opposition, even if the movement is BDS and you don't care so much about like withdrawing financial support, creating a movement that people can sign up to and that interrupts people's feeling of Zionism is actually a huge intervention, right? So I wonder if you could just talk to us as a sort of closeout and before we take questions about what you learn, what your research into Zionist modes of power teaches us about how to effectively resist.
Thanks for that question, yeah, and it's a nice one to bring us back to like the present moment and the political implications of the research I've done for this book, given the genocide that's unfolding in Gaza and what we all need to like go off and do in our workplaces and universities and wherever we can in our communities. Yeah, so resistance, I guess number one, the implication is, yeah, as we've talked about, like, clearly we know that the US government, the British government, and obviously the Israeli government are perpetrating the genocide of Palestinians. There are also supporting organizations in the fabric of our societies. They have names and addresses. The people who work for them have LinkedIn profiles. They've got business cards. And I think what we're seeing happen in Gaza now has to be a turning point where we say, where we really, you know, start challenging these people, and everywhere we meet them more strongly, calling them out. And in terms of the impact of BDS, so that's the kind of like, but BDS is also a powerful offensive tool. I'm very proud to support the BDS movement and be a BDS activist. I think it is, I mean, Aaron Kanani calls it the biggest anti-colonial movement in Britain today, and I believe it's powerful, and we know that because Israel has thrown millions of dollars at combating it, and that's not just, although it is partly the Zionist fragility of the narrative it's putting forward, which is it's really successfully mainstreamed the narrative of Israeli apartheid. It's not a narrative, it's a reality, but it's helped to do that. And I think, as you say, the cultural power of BDS, I think, as an educational tool as part of it. You know, we wouldn't get liberal human rights NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch having to contend with that reality, which obviously Palestinians have been talking about for decades, if we didn't have BDS and the growth of BDS over time. So I compare the BDS movement in the book with the Arab League boycott of previous decades, which was firstly like predominantly from the Arab League nations, but also mostly more economically focused. And we know because Israel is getting $3 billion aid from US every year, like economically, we're not going to make so much of a dent. But what BDS does differently is not only that it's kind of has gained support in the US and Britain and Europe, Western sponsors of Israel, but also it looks to operate in the cultural sphere, in academia, which have always been hubs of left-wing progressive racial justice movements and so on, and in the cultural sphere. So I think it's got serious potential. It's as an ethical obligation for us as people living, you know, in countries which are deeply complicit in the genocide in Gaza and in Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing. It's imperative, it's some absolute moral duty for us to fight to sever all the ways in which you're implicit through BDS, solidarity activism, and it can make a powerful contribution. Like, liberation is not going to come from, you know, it's going to come from Palestinians themselves, and they're an inspiration to the world in showing us, you know, the dignity of their struggle for liberation. But we, as kind of people who want to be in solidarity, that is the most meaningful, practical solidarity act we can take. So I think to take one thing away from tonight, we all need to like step up our BDS activism in a big way from now until Palestine is free from the river to the sea.
I think we can take some questions now if you have them. Are you?
Thank you very much. I haven't finished reading the book, I'm about halfway through, and I noticed you made a reference to the Gaton Institute, based here in New York, and I wonder if you could talk about it and maybe other kind of right-wing financialist institutions that seem to be a part of this Zionist network.
Yeah, sure. So the Gaton Institute is a rabidly Islamophobic foundation based in New York. I think it's a 501c3, whatever the sort of tax terminology is here. And it pumps out, a mixture of neoconservative, Islamophobic, and Zionist propaganda articles. And its president and main donor is a woman called Nina Rosenwald, who's a right-wing Zionist. And I think, Gaton, I suppose it encapsulates an intersection I'm interested in, which is the right-wing Zionist movement and organized Islamophobia. There's some other examples in the book of pro-Israel organizations which have helped to spread the film Obsession in previous years, which was a major kind of anti-Islam propaganda. I mean, and I argue there's a kind of obvious rationale for that. Israel's racist obsession with the demographic threat that Palestinian existence poses is not that different from the racist obsessions of people here in the United States and in Britain with the growth of communities of color. And in Britain there's a guy called Douglas Murray who sums this up, and he's really obsessed with the fact that white people are going to be a minority, and he's very scared about that. And so I guess the other thing to say about Gaton, though, is that because it has so much money, it's able to cultivate a veneer of respectability, right? So Daniel Finkelstein, who is a conservative peer sits in the House of Lords in the UK, was on the board for a while. In the last few years, he did issue I didn't know who they were, excuse my French. And he sort of dissociated himself from them. But they've also hosted events in Westminster in Parliament in collaboration with Conservative Friends of Israel. So it's a good example of the most extreme wing of the Zionist movement, and how Zionist politics brings not only support for the genocide of the Palestinians that we're seeing right now, but also opens the door to Islamophobia, draconian sort of counterterrorism policies, and all other kinds of anti-liberation politics as well, no doubt. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Hi. So I know you were talking a lot about kind of how Israel's kind of influenced lots of organizations in the West. I was wondering if there's the opposite of how much organizations or people in the West influence maybe elections or different organizations in Israel.
So the question, I don't know did everyone hear that? The question was about the influence of organizations. Did I get this right? Influence of organizations external to Israel on Israeli politics. Yeah. Sorry, politics and culture. Yeah. It's not something I'm an expert on, to be honest, but I think it's interesting. It's an interesting debate in that when I've talked about how the Zionist movement seeks to, first and foremost, lobby the Zionist movement. Actually, you could argue it was anti-Semitic in the ways it tells Jewish people, it's your duty to be a supporter of Israel. But those who are Zionists have often said no, but like, we should never criticize Israel. It's not our place. It's odd. It's this odd kind of dual thing where like the Jewish groups who are pro-Israel will spend some of them spend a lot of time like supporting Israel and saying this is an inherent part of her Jewish identity rather than clearly a Zionist political position. But then they will draw the line, historically have sometimes drawn the line at interfering in Israeli politics. But actually we're seeing that break down. We're seeing that kind of cordon sanitaire break down, even in like Jewish communities who are Zionist, elements of the Jewish community which are Zionist, because the ones who are, I said liberal Zionism is a vanishingly small trend, but it sort of is existing. They have, elements of it have started being like, oh, but we actually don't like Netanyahu. I mean, many of them still, offer unconditional support for the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But there have been times when, pro-Israel groups have felt uncomfortable with, I think in the 80s with Menachem Begin as well. You got some, and what's interesting then, and I talk a little bit about this in my book, is that you get then like, there's examples of the Israeli embassy essentially disciplining bits of the sort of more liberal Zionist movement, slapping them down and saying like, listen, if you want to do pro-Israel advocacy, you can't do it without the Israeli embassy's kind of blessing, and so and if there are sort of slightly less right-wing Zionist groups than the Israeli government's line, there's tensions arise. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon. For me, I know like some people don't. I don't want to like constantly. One of the concerns I had when I wrote the book was like, in the end, I'm decentering Palestinians, but I'm turning the lens upward to the Zionist movement and banging on about Jews constantly. But I think that it's very important for me. It's very important that like more Jewish people stand up and say not in my name, and that we see a kind of continued fracturing, not because, and someone made this at the conference we had last week, ultimately Zionism isn't about Jewish people, and so, but it's a powerful tool in the propaganda armory, you know what I mean? So I hope that answers your question somewhat. Unless you had anything to add, Emmaia?
I think you have something to add. Actually, I'll draw from your book. So I think that one way to take your question is, do organizations that say that they're interested in shaping Israel have an effect? And you're saying to a certain extent those get disciplined, and I think that's correct. But there is another kind of influence that organizations and movements outside of Israel have on Israeli politics, and that's when there are successful anti-racist narratives that that begin to make a dent in how people understand Palestinian liberation. So, for example, the idea that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, which is now a narrative that's been taken up not only in the U.S. but in Israel, that comes from here. That comes from the success of the Standing Rock protests, and from people's sort of the popularization of discourse about indigeneity, that suddenly Zionist organizations are like, wait, us, and you write about that. So you could talk about that a little bit. It goes in the other direction. And actually, if you wouldn't mind taking on pinkwashing as well, because the narratives that we hear about pinkwashing that come out of Israel, I think can also be traced in that way. So talk to us a little bit about how those ideas get sucked up from movements outside of Israel and then translated into Zionism.
Say that last bit again, how the ideas of pinkwashing.
Well, the question is, how do ideas from outside influence Israeli politics, right? So there's the idea of indigeneity as a sort of mobilizing discourse, and there's also the idea of like gay liberation as a mobilizing discourse, and both of those have made their way into Israeli politics. Just curious to hear more from you about what are the mechanisms of that? How do you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, I think it isn't a sort of simple unidirectional relationship where the Israeli government tells pro-Israel groups here like what propaganda points to use, or like, there is a circulation of strategy. And, as I mentioned, the Global Coalition for Israel, which is this propaganda conference that's had every few years, where I think what happens is, best practice from a certain context that has worked, maybe in the United States, might be moved to Britain, or I argue that I think that actually the Global Coalition for Israel might have been something that existed in Britain before. It might have been the precursor. So that is part of what that conference does. It circulates sort of, narrative, strategy, funding circulates around the movement. There's been British Zionist groups who have received money from Israeli Zionist groups, and clearly, there's still a role. Historically, it was much more of a role of funding going to Israel from fundraising in around other countries. In terms of the bit about pinkwashing, I don't talk about it loads in my book, but again, I think it's just one other liberal alibi that Israel has, despite being the most far-right government we've ever seen in Israel, which is saying something. I don't think many queers are fooled by it. When I say that, maybe that's my little circles. Clearly, Tel Aviv is a big gay destination for your sort of cis white men who have no politics. But Jazbir Puar calls it homo-nationalism, right? This is a trend that we see, sadly, with the more that homosexuality, at least, if not transgenderism, do I want to say that? Trans liberation is not so much assimilated, but homosexuality, there's an element clearly that's assimilated and ceases to have radical politics. But I was saying to Emmaia on the train here, I'm in a group of hundreds of people WhatsApp organizing back home in London, under the banner Queers for Palestine, and part of organizing a festival which we're going to call Not Gay as in Happy, Queer as in Free Palestine. So I think, I'm really excited to do politics at that intersection that gets back to the radical roots of queer liberation and it's intertwined with intertwinement with Palestinian liberation. And I think that's another point to make, is that, maybe I've already made, but not only do we need coalitions of all kinds of social justice and all kinds of liberation struggles to support Palestinian liberation, but our enemies are often the same, and the foundations that fund Zionism and the Zionist organizations themselves and the governments that support it are also those who are enemies of Black Lives Matter, that are letting migrants drown in the Channel or perish at the Mexico border, that are passing legislation against trans healthcare, that are issuing climate denial, spreading climate denialism. So it's not just a kind of strategic and principled thing. It's there's material realities. Tear gas canisters made by the US, not only used on Palestinians in Israel, they're used against, in Ferguson here. So that's what the T-shirt's all about, I think, isn't it? Which Emmaia kindly lent me, because I forgot all my clothes at Heathrow Airport. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so I'll leave it there. Do we have other questions, or should we?
Hi. I was wondering if you had any sense of the kind of media suppression or college campus suppression that we've seen in the past week, with law professors writing editorials about "don't hire my students," and MSNBC apparently taking Muslim anchors off the air, and this kind of thing. Do you have a sense that this is a kind of pressure to a different degree that's happening right now, and what could you talk a little bit more about the background to this kind of pressure?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very important question. What do I want to say in response? I think that don't know how well I've articulated it, but I feel like I've only just really fully grasped it myself these last couple of days, is that the Palestine issue, Hassan Kanafani says that the Palestinian cause is not just a cause for Palestinians, it's a cause for every revolutionary. And it is a microcosm of why I got interested in it. It's a microcosm of refugee rights, racial justice, borders, prisons, like housing, land struggles. And so it is like, I don't want to sound too like Manichean and Huntington clashing civilizations myself, but it is like, it is a cause like that is like the West's insistence on allowing Israel impunity is fraying the edges of like the kind of values we claim to hold. You know, free speech, like freedom of assembly, you know, they're proving to be incompatible with the defense of Israeli apartheid, and defense of Israeli apartheid is winning. Like Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, he's actually used to be a human rights lawyer, unbelievably, and he was asked on radio or television, but what about, you know, Israel cutting off water and you know, electricity and food to the Gaza Strip, you know, and he said Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. And I don't want anything to compromise the principle, you know, international law must be upheld, but I don't want anything to compromise the principle of support for Israel. And so the principle of support for Israel is actually being held above the principle of international law. And, you know, we have to choose. And I do think it's kind of, it does feel a bit like, you know, a friend was texting me today being like, it's, you know, this is a very historic time we're living in, and it just feels like the lines are crystallizing with like Netanyahu's rhetoric and the tweet I read out, and like there are two ways that it can go, and that's what I'm trying to articulate, the way that the issue of Palestine is clearly first and foremost about Palestinian liberation, but it also transcends that, and it kind of encapsulates the struggle for like humanity against state violence and corporate power. So sorry, that's not a very practical question, but answer to your question, but that's how I understand it. And I was banging on at Emmaia earlier about like the concept of the imperial backlash, which is something that Hannah Arendt and Aimé Césaire and Michel Foucault have written about, which is where like the violence that is practiced in the colonies boomerangs back to eventually to the metropole, the kind of imperial core. And you know, you've seen it in the States, you've seen it in Britain, you saw it in France with, you know, massacres of North African protesters. And it's, you know, I'm not trying to compare the repression of like Palestine Solidarity activism or, you know, what we're seeing in the media with the violence, genocidal violence being meted out to Palestinians. But I do think it is a very distant reverberation of that same violence, or at least that's how I see the connection. And I think that like Anthony Lowenstein has a book out called The Palestine Laboratory about how like Gaza has been a testing ground for the global arms industry, and how that, and you know, as I said earlier, we already see like the militarization of the police force is a way to understand the, you know, the way that comes back around and bites us in the ass. So like obviously first and foremost we all stand in solidarity with Palestinian liberation because it's the right thing to do, but you know, ultimately like it affects us too, and it's very true that kind of no one is free until we're all free, and that we're struggling for ourselves, and that's what solidarity is, right? It's not an act of charity. It's like we're the same struggle, I think. Do you want to add anything, Emmaia, about that? Like,
I'll add something, and then if nobody else has a question, I'll turn it into a question. But what I would add from actually just, as I was thinking about exactly what you're asking, because obviously like feels like we're under like an anvil right now. And as I was reading through Hil's book, it's this conception of Zionism as a movement from above that is so helpful in thinking about these things. So for example, like I'm shadow banned on Twitter. Nothing I write goes anywhere. And I know there are thousands and thousands of people who are in the same situation. And yet my feed is filled with Palestine solidarity. So imagine if we weren't shadow banned, right? Imagine how loud our voices would be and how unavoidable. And why are we in this position? It's because we live in and we're subject to these infrastructures that are actually controlled by a few people. So if you have a sort of sociality, if you could just like picture, you know, whoever has dinner at Cipriani or whatever, right? If there's like just a small layer of people who are either they're personally Zionist or they're connected to, you know, for political reasons, they want to enforce the rules that Zionist, institutions want. All it takes is a small layer of those people to be organized against everybody else. It could be institutions, it could be, Biden, right? It doesn't take a lot of people. It just takes them to be highly placed. And I think that's what Hil is talking about in this idea of Zionism as a movement from above. And you really, there are compromises that those institutions make, usually in order to be perceived as democratic institutions. But when power needs them, they're there, right? So they shut it down. And that to me is the explanation. What is the explanation for Anderson Cooper crying over an Israeli family that's been kidnapped and not over Palestinians? I have nothing for that one, I'm sorry. But is this white gay man? I don't know. That could be your explanation for many things. But I do think that this analytic that you offer of Zionism as a movement from above, which really debunks the idea that it's a social movement, and really debunks the idea that it's Jewish self-determination, which is the claim that's always used to try and shut us up. I think it's really helpful to think about that. My question...
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of a bit in the book that I quote Corey Robin, who's an academic here in the States, and he wrote a short blog about the BDS movement on college campuses and how... it's the vice. Do you call them vice chancellors here? The heads of the universities. He called it a very elite backlash, and that's because it would be a good way to sum up the book as well. Yeah, it's the highest echelons of power, the heads of the media organizations, the heads of government, heads of universities that are pro-Israel, basically. And you don't get very far in the political sphere usually, with very rare exceptions, unless you adopt that ideology and are socialized in that way. But our strength, as we see on the streets of every city in the world, is we have the people's hearts and minds. And yes, there's institutional power, is still kind of trying to defend this line. But the Zionist movement are worried about it, and I try and show that in my book, and testament to the Palestinian liberation struggle and to the solidarity movement, that the hundreds of thousands that we're seeing on the street, I think there was 150,000 in London, that scares the shit out of them, excuse my French again, because whilst we do not by any means live in particularly democratic countries, that's not to say that we don't have power, because we do. Again, don't know if I answered your question, but it's a nice little rant.
That was my question to you. Questions or do we have more time? I don't know what time we have until.
It's 7:45.
If anyone has a question, then great. But if you want to ask the question in private later, you can also do that. I just want to point out that we do have books for sale at the front desk. So if you want to pick one up, this would be your opportunity. And feel free to, we do close at 9 o'clock, but you have time to kind of mingle and talk about what you just heard, ask any questions with each other, talk to each other. But yeah, thank you.
I just want to make a pitch for the book, right? Because this has been a wide-ranging conversation, but this book is an incredibly accessible and lyrical and narrative story to read. It's divided into short chapters, and it's really comprehensive. So this is both an incredibly well-researched book. Hil is a researcher, and it really shows. And also, it's written in this incredibly humane and accessible way that makes it really useful. So I want to not just talk about it, but also make a pitch for the book. And I thank you for it, Hil.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. And I think I want to reiterate what Emmaia put on her Instagram when she was just talking about this book thing tonight, which was that if you can be a protest against genocide instead, then do that. So don't sit at home and read the book. Get out there and do what you can. I know that you all will be doing that. So yeah, onwards.
And I'll just add on that note, there will be a protest tomorrow, 1 p.m. at City Hall. So if anyone's interested or have questions, you can ask any of our staff member here. And we're also organizing a national march on Washington on November 4th. and that's a Saturday, 2 weeks from now. It's going to be really big. People are going to be coming from all over the country. And if you're interested, we do have a sign-up form, and we will figure out a busing situation from New York. So if you want to join a lot of people in this big action, this historical action, you can come to the front. We have a QR code. Thank you so much.